Yep. Now we're all going to get a chance to ask our three speakers some questions. And I'm going to start, and then we will go to the audience. So Heather and Vicki and Peter, come join me up here on stage. And because we had technical difficulties, Peter, we do have your first clip ready.
No, it's cool.
You're okay? You don't want to
Totally
share? Okay.
Yep.
Cool. One of the things that struck me listening to the three of you is that when we talk about the issue of climate change, sometimes it can seem so overwhelming. Nobody knows what to do with it. And let me give you all an example. When the IPCC report came out a couple of weeks ago and said that we had basically a carbon budget in the world to spend, and we had spent half of it and more than half of it, and if we keep going by mid-century, we're really going to be in serious trouble. And I was giving my little summary to the executives at NBC News about it, and somebody said, well, we're screwed next. And so, because it just seems so overwhelming. Is this a situation where the problem is so big that there's nothing we can do about it, or can we slow down the rate of climate change so the worst doesn't have to happen?
Well, I think with agriculture, with what I'm seeing these people doing, they're getting, at the most conservative, they're getting 1,000 pounds of carbon sequestered per acre per year, and we're seeing it could be much, much more than that. And there's enough acreage of grasslands and grazing lands, it's 3.5 billion hectares, and then enough acreage of farmland, 1.5 billion hectares, that if you start treating nature like you've heard already, it wants to be healthy. I'm fully convinced that the natural system wants to be rocking. And I actually get to sleep at night because of these innovators out there right now. It's a huge deal to get these few ranchers to scale and to get every rancher doing this, or enough ranchers doing this. But there's every reason to believe that it can happen. It can happen fast. I mean, this country has turned on a pivot for war. Let's turn on a pivot for soil. Let's see how that goes.
Vicki, do you think it's solvable?
You know, I think that we are past the point of not having climate change. We're already seeing impacts. I mean, I've been at this, as you said, for some time now, and the projections of climate change are happening in our lifetime, and they're frankly happening faster and more dramatically than we had projected some 5 or 10 years ago. So I do think that we are in for a rocky future, but I do think that we can adapt to it to some extent, but we can only adapt if we start curbing our emissions. And so we really can't do just one or the other. For us to live in a world that we want to live in, that we want our kids to live in, we have to start taking dramatic actions to reduce our carbon, in addition to just living with the consequences through some of the examples that I shared.
Heather, do you think it's solvable?
Absolutely. But I agree exactly with what Vicki's saying, is that we have to have an international cap. There's no doubt about it. So anybody who has the power to do that, do that. Everybody else has lots of options. And I think mostly we think the cap is the only option. And so we freeze in every other realm of our lives. And you saw a lot of examples today, from farming to the way you protect your own house from storms, that are real options now that can happen everywhere. They're there. The science is done. The options are real. It's tangible. It can happen. We just have to embrace it. And I think the potential for that to flip things really quickly, as you said, is very real if we just do it.
Okay, so now here's a challenge to the three of you. For everybody who's here today, what is the one thing they can go home and do? Let's assume they recycle, they have reusable water bottles, they've done all the things, they sign up for green power, all the things with their utility companies. But what's the one thing that you want them to go home and do tonight, in the next week, to keep us moving along a path of progress?
I'm a policy person, and I live in Washington, so I can't resist not telling you to change a light bulb, but telling you to call your local officials, your congressperson, your senator, because I really do think that we need policy. We need an international policy. The climate negotiations are underway again. The next real meaningful one is going to be in Paris in 2015, and the countries really have to take on some new targets, and we are in this not just as a city of Chicago, for example, or a country, but the whole world. And so they need to hear from us, because the Senate would have to ratify any treaty. You know, it's really important for us to have policies that incentivize good behaviors. I mean, some of the examples that I gave, they really do save people money, but it's not like people are just, doing that on their own. Often having incentive structures, money that's available, tax breaks, things like that can really make a difference to really motivate people to change.
Heather?
I would say after you call your representative, call your water company and tell them you want some of your existing fees spent in a different way. And then when you're done with that, go shop with your money and vote with your dollars on companies you know are doing things you like.
Yeah, I'm sure, but how many people in here have an Uncle Phil? Okay. Here's the trick. When you speak to your Uncle Phil, the first thing I do is I say what I think. I say climate change is real, it's happening, the science is strong, and the way we're going to solve it is going to make life on Earth better for everybody. And then I say, what do you think? And that's the real magic moment that hasn't happened very often for my Uncle Phil, is someone like me asking, what do you think? And he'll say, thank you for asking. And then he'll say, if someone like my Uncle Phil, plenty of skeptics have been dragged to my screenings, they'll say, climate change is a hoax, Al Gore's a fraud, and the professors are studying this because that's where all the grant money is. And I say, fine. I'm not going to change your opinion about climate change right now, am I? And they say, no. And I say, you're not going to change my opinion, right? And they say, no. Now we're laughing like the old senators used to do, where they'd get along most of the day. And then we talk about things, and when I talk about wind, everyone wants wind. 70% of Americans want wind, and according to Google, we'll pay extra for it. And I say, what about solar? And they say, well, they love it. And 90% of Americans want solar to be a major source of power. And when I mention geothermal, they don't get it, but they like it. And I don't have any stats because no one gets it anyway. And then energy efficiency is a no-brainer. And all of a sudden, we've got a big enough policy for energy just built right there. And that's what I'm saying. I really don't think we're a polarized country on big issues, big enough. Big enough. So have conversations, reasonable conversations, and then elect reasonable people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that I found in covering the environment, and particularly covering the issue of climate change, is that you have some unusual allies in this. Corporate America is looking for certainty, if you will, on climate policy. And they realize that going green, if you will, is actually better for their bottom line. I was just talking to a man who used to run one of the banks in this country, and they built a platinum LEED building in Washington, and they found he looked at it, and trust me, this guy's not a tree hugger by any stretch of the imagination, and it cost him more money than he thought, but they found that the return on investment was so good that it made more sense. And now all the bank branches are becoming are green branches, if you will. And he said, why wouldn't I do it? I mean, now that I look at it, and he said, actually, now it's more cost effective than when they built the building in Washington. And so I think you're seeing, from a business standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. From the grassroots aspect, in cities like Chicago, in cities like New York, in cities like Seattle, you see this, but it's the middle, and in particular, our federal government that doesn't, and in particular Congress, that is reluctant to move. So how do you change that?
Well, just to defend the federal government a little bit, the Department of Defense is on fire with this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, they want every base to be resilient, meaning off the grid, meaning they're going to have to power those bases, and they're using renewable fuel in a big way, and they're using energy efficiency in a big way. They don't want to have to bring fuel to the front lines, because 1 out of 5 people who have been killed going to the front lines have been bringing fuel to the front lines. And so they want to have wind and solar out there. And I'm not a war hawk at all, but when my tax dollars are being spent towards research, towards these things, I'm psyched about that. Department of Energy is working really hard on this stuff. The EPA is working really hard on this stuff. And the CAFE standards that just got doubled a year and a half ago, that's a big deal. But yeah, Congress has been a real headache. When I say we're not a polarized country, I'm not talking about Congress. Yeah.
And the states actually have played a leading role. We work at the Climate Center with a lot of states, and the majority of states have renewable portfolio standards that encourage or require a certain percentage of your energy to come from renewable resources, and that's part of what's driven the cost of wind and solar down. And it's been a win-win, and they're doing it for all kinds of reasons. It's red states and blue states. They're not all citing climate change, but they are really doing this for economic development.
I want to say something back where you started with companies and the corporate bottom line, and I think there's a couple interesting things happening there. With Coca-Cola, their biggest bottler is in Mexico, and they're investing in watersheds too. not from the sustainability arm of their company, but from the risk side of their company. This is their core business that's making this investment. It's not for the public goodwill. It's not for their green image. It's for their real returns. And I think we're going to see that shift more and more often, where it's going from a nice thing to do and a way to get into a niche market to the real deal for your bottom line. This is also happening, with coffee. The shade-grown coffee started out as a niche market, more expensive coffee. People bought it that were on that part of the side of sustainability already. Now what you're seeing with these pest outbreaks is that this is it. You've got to have it to produce coffee, period. And I think that's going to happen more and more with both changing land use and changing climate.
And with the carbon sequestration ability of these new grazing techniques, I was thinking, what's the industry that's using carbon sequestration more than anyone? It's the oil industry. So I'm now in negotiations with a major oil company, and they're going to ask me and my gang to study the business models, the potential for business models for them using this carbon that the ranchers are putting in the ground. If they can somehow work with the ranchers, train more ranchers, and then say, hey, we're making the earth a little bit better by getting more carbon in the ground. And I think it's very exciting, because then we're shifting a big machine a little bit this way. It could be very powerful. We're in negotiations, so I can't say which one yet, but it's big.
And I think another exciting thing is just what consumers are doing. In August, we purchased the most fuel-efficient cars ever. The average MPG of the light trucks and cars and SUVs that we purchased reached a record. I mean, already changes are happening on a consumer level, which is good, and we're forcing changes. We're making things better when we get the opportunity.
But I'll challenge NBC, because NBC's here. There's a lot of stuff happening right now that's not being told, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Right.
And major things are happening all over the world. I'll give you one quick example. In Spain, in July of 2011, there's a solar thermal plant that heats up salt during the day, uses that heated salt to produce electrons at night by creating steam off of the hot salt. And that one plant, one time, produced electrons for 24 hours. And virtually no one that I've ever talked to in any industry, including the solar industry, knows about that. It's just bad storytelling. It's not that this is a Wright brothers moment. This thing produced electrons for 24 hours, and it was a solar plant. And yeah, the Wright brothers plane flew 45 feet, the first flight. So obviously there's a long way to go to get to United Airlines, but it's happening. It really is happening. Just buy grass-finished beef. That'll help quite a bit.
Right. Well, and that's going to be the game changer for wind and solar. When they figure out a way to store the power that's generated for 24 hours, so it can become an on-demand energy
To your
source.
point, policy. Look what California just did.
Absolutely. And California actually precipitated the federal standards being aggressive as they are. And so part of it, Anne, is consumer choice and the fact that oil prices have been high or volatile enough that people want to have more efficient cars. But part of it's, frankly, that we mandate them now. The federal government has a standard that's based on California's leadership in other states that requires us over time to get 54.5 miles per gallon, which was unthinkable just a handful of years ago.
But talking to someone I know in the car industry said it. Beyond that is that today's consumer is looking for a fuel-efficient car in a different way. And not only a fuel-efficient car, they also want a car that is going to be less harmful to the environment. And you're seeing the sales of hybrids pick up for that reason. As electric cars are able to go further on a single charge, perhaps they'll pick up, and I think the jury is still out there. But they are seeing, the industry is seeing a shift in consumer attitudes, just what consumers want, not mandated by government.
And I had my chance to drive the Tesla for the first time yesterday, which was a fabulous car, and it's one of those kind of things that just gets people excited. Not all of us can afford a Tesla. I certainly can't, but it was still fun to drive. And so it is creating a market for these vehicles that go above and beyond for all kinds of reasons, just the quality of them. But this is a good time to pitch another call that you can make that's supportive of the EPA standards, because the two biggest sectors, of course, in terms of pollution are vehicles, which are in some ways under control with some of these new regulations, but power plant standards. And EPA actually is moving forward with power plant standards to reduce the carbon pollution from existing power plants, I expect it will be challenged in Congress and in court. We're already seeing some of that. So that's another area where you can support EPA in trying to reduce that other large source of carbon pollution.
Yeah, in fact, the Supreme Court is going to take that issue up in this term. So anyways, let's lift the House lights, and I hope so, you have questions for our panelists. There are 2 microphones, I am told. I can see one person with a microphone. Yes, sir.
Hi. You know, all this is great, and I'm a big greenie. I got 30 solar panels on my roof and everything. And all this takes an hour and a half to explain this to most people. Uncle Phil isn't going to sit there for an hour and a half. I think we're really just losing the messaging. I have a Volt. The first thing I hear from my friends who's driving a Mercedes is, oh, what's the payback on that? And the government's giving you money to drive that. And I say, first, what's the payback on your Mercedes? Mm-hmm. Nobody's thinking payback on that. And as far as the, idea of us helping to reduce fuel consumption, when I save a gallon of oil, that's a gallon of oil you get to waste wherever you want or put in an airplane somewhere. So we need bumper sticker slogans to say, hey, Uncle Phil, you're a consumer, not an investor. A way of looking at solar panels, you say, I ask people, well, how much would you pay for all your electricity for the next 40 years today? And then tell me whether it's a good investment. If I have a 15-year payback on my solar panels, that's 7% on my money. What are you getting in a CD? It's tax-free money. It's a CD on the roof. You know, put it into a municipal bond, a CD, put it in a DC instead of a CD. And, we need to focus those messages to get these people, because you are not going to win with most Uncle Phils or friends, Tom and Larry.
I'm going to disagree with you. You're not going to win on that. I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate what you said. I like that DC
Maybe
CD.
Maybe it should be in Carbon 2.0.
Yeah, well, we're making
carbonation.
The reason we're going to make a lot of short films from here on out is exactly that, just to focus those things. But one of my good friends in Louisville is the most libertarian person I've ever met. He thinks the government maybe should be taxed to then do defense, but that's it. Like no roads, no water, no schools, anything. And he thinks there should be a carbon tax because libertarians hate externalities. And that's something I don't think too many people have been tapping into. My cousin Eric, same thing, hates the fact that all these costs that are part of using carbon-based fuels, fossil fuels, aren't included in the cost of using it. They don't like that. And so there you've got people on a whole spectrum of people who would agree on this. And I just think it's a lack of leadership. I think it's a lack of good storytelling. I agree with you. But there's a lot of people working on it too. So, your frustration's heard, and I can say I'm on it, and I know other people are on it.
Who else has a question? Yes.
I'm also interested in the connection between the big picture and the individual. So I'm wondering if you've seen any campaigns that really tie that together. And I think it's great what we're doing with cars, but this country consumes so many plastic water bottles, and it takes like 3 times the amount of water of what's actually in the water bottle, and like 1/4 of the oil. And I was talking about composting, and someone said, isn't that what Europeans do? And I don't think people really think they can make a difference unless they're a farmer, a politician, or a contractor or something. So are there any good campaigns that you've seen that tie the big picture to what one person can do?
You're the filmmaker.
Yeah, no, I'm working on it. It's really important that the campaign is the biggest issue. I say to folks, I think the fossil fuel industry are the best storytellers since Shakespeare. I think they're brilliant. And every single conference I've gone to, and anything even close to what we're talking about today, that's something everyone says. We miss storytelling. We're not very good at storytelling. And that's why ASU brought me in, because they're doing all this great work at the School of Sustainability, and they weren't telling their story very well. And that's okay, because I don't think scientists have to be good storytellers. Let's just pair scientists with good storytellers. That should be part of a grant. If you get an NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant, you should have a storyteller as part of your team so that your grant doesn't just sit on a shelf, it actually gets to the public, because there's so many great ideas out there. So, but like I said to this gentleman, that's what I'm doing. is working on those things. We're going to do a lot of really short pieces, a lot of, and tying it into people is very important. I think population is really important, so we can get into that too.
Heather, have you seen any campaign that gets water usage, when it comes to water usage, sort of the big picture and the individual brings them together?
I mean, I think a lot of these activities now that are reaching out to cities to get them to switch the way they're investing in resources. I mean, it's not the individual like you're asking for, it's the municipal water managers. It's touching a lot of individuals in ways that I think are much more efficient, honestly. And those campaigns have been really effective, especially in Latin America. There's a huge movement now in Latin America to switch these investments in cities. And there's over 42 cities now, major cities in Latin America, that are already switching to investing in their water sources instead of treatment facilities. And some of that comes from local movement, but some of it comes from knowing the science behind the reality of how they're spending their money. I think there's a ton of space to continue to develop these, as you're suggesting. And I think that I'm going to actually peg environmental organizations as a place that needs to improve, because we spend a lot of time saying, turn the water off when you brush your teeth. And I'm sorry, right now, if you don't do that, it's just bad. It's not good to do that. It's like, it's a given. You should do that. Everybody should do that no matter what. That's not what we should say on Earth Day. So I think we ourselves have to do a lot more work in figuring out the messages of what should you do on Earth Day now, because it's got to go beyond what we talk about, fill up your thermos instead of buying a bottle of water. We have to go way beyond that now.
I think we're on the foundation of a problem that happened in the 70s from the environmental movement and the organic food movement. When we were told we were supposed to eat carob instead of chocolate, like that's going to save the planet. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but that was a really bad thing to tell people, because carob stinks and chocolate's great. And I think that's been a real big problem for a long time.
Yeah, sir.
Would you comment on the fact that many countries in the EU are so far ahead of us in renewable energy? Recently, Chancellor Merkel came out with her objectives for her new term and commented on the fact that she's going to phase out nuclear energy completely and ramp up even further the renewable energy within her country, which is already quite high.
So, I mean, again, policy, it was a factor. There is more public acceptance of global warming in Europe and more support for policies, even policies that cost something. So it's not a terrific name, but in Germany they've had things called feed-in tariffs, which means that you can actually feed in a higher price into the grid if you provide power from renewable resources like wind or solar. Not that we think of Germany as a bastion of terrific solar power, but part of how they became a leader was because the people who generated that power were assured a certain price for that investment
for 20
through
years.
These kind of long-term contracts, right? And that name isn't very popular here. So you see some places, even Nebraska. I mean, other parts of Florida, parts that you don't necessarily traditionally think of as the leading states on this issue or the leading cities, experimenting with something similar called, I think they're called CLEAN, and that stands for something, Clean Investment Strategies, where you're basically guaranteeing people who are the early movers to provide that renewable a return on their investment, and it's really helped to reduce the cost in the long run by assuring them a market in the early days.
But think about Europe as size as well. From London to Moscow is New York to LA. And so we do have we all wish there was trains in the US, right? And there was a bullet train that was going to go from Chicago to Atlanta. It was going to go through Louisville, which is my hometown. This is great, right? But we have a much bigger country than Europe. I like that Europe's leading the way on this. We used to lead. When it came time to build our transcontinental railroad, we were way ahead of the world on that. And we're way ahead of the world on a few other things, but I still think there's more happening now than anyone really realizes. It just hasn't been coalesced yet. I think this is what critical mass looks like before it hits. And I wouldn't be so down on the US. As a matter of fact, I'm not. I think the fact, anyway, I'll go on that, but I'll just say that.
Let me get one more question in, because we're almost out of time. Yes, the woman with the blonde hair here.
I'm a great believer. I'm in the public relations business, but so I can say that I'm a great believer in the power of the people. In this room, you are preaching to the converted. We wouldn't be sitting here if we didn't believe in what you're you're saying. We wouldn't have chosen this. I really don't think that what you're talking about is knowledge-based to this country. So I'm looking to the media, not only to campaigns. You really have to search out this information. If you told me about bees, you tell the average person about bees and they don't even know what you're talking about. So where is the media? Where are those people who literally changed cigarette smoking in this world, in this country rather? We don't have any campaigns. We don't have media campaigns. I'm talking about Earth Day once a year. I'm talking about consistent campaign to try to change the average guy on the street who doesn't even know about this.
Well, back to the personal choice, and it was states attorneys general, I think is the way you say it,
Yep.
who got the cigarette companies, down. It wasn't me. It wasn't, what I'm saying? Sometimes it is at scale. And I don't know anyone who helped wire up a power line. I don't want everyone to be involved in how we go to solar in a way, because we don't need everyone involved. We just want people to want it. That's the key. We just want people to want it. And then the few people who are experts will do it, right? It's not like everyone can build their own solar plant. Well, that's the game. I mean, I'm sitting here right now because obviously you've pretty good example that this will be preaching to the converted, right? But the converted need tools, and I'm trying to help give the converted tools. So that's.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Heather and to Vicki and to Peter, and thanks to all of you.